Good evening, everybody. Thursday night is mini symposium night. Was anybody here at the 2013 symposium at Brunel? Tom Korff and Carl Granger spoke at the 2013 symposium that was at Brunel University. Previously, we had worked with Carl and Tom here in the initial stages, I think, or formation stages of some of what they're going to present. They came and volunteered with us for, was it a week, was it? Just under a week? And it was all top secret at the time. We had no idea what they were up to, what they were doing, and we were sort of helping them and working, but we had no idea what it was all about. Actually, we had no idea what it was about. We were working with the concepts and precepts around fit and biomechanics, but it felt like it was the teacher-student relationship was all wrong because we had a professor of biomechanics and his senior research assistant. So it was a very strange time, and Jerry kept dipping in and out. That's another story. But anyway, it was great fun, and that was maybe 4 years ago. And then that led into Tom speaking at the symposium, which was a fascinating lecture. So you're kind of in the hands of two intellectual heavyweights when it comes to biomechanics. And so this title, which has intrigued us from the day that Tom gave it to us, is a fantastic subject. And the great thing about this is original research that's being presented. And original research in cycling biomechanics, a bit of the holy grail. It doesn't happen very often where original research gets presented. So we're going to film this, and then we're going to push it out there probably tomorrow, or at least Monday. Get it out there so it's actually the research and the information is out there in the public domain. So, and that's very generous of Tom and Carl to do that, because they've created and done all this hard work, and it's going to go out there for free. And you're going to be the first people to see it publicly delivered. So that's about as much as I'm going to say. I'm going to say welcome to Cyclefit, and looking forward to it. Chaps. Okay.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Phil, and Morgan and Julian for inviting us, and thank you very much, Simon, for keeping us on track and organising everything and finding a lecture on the last minute. So my name is Tom Korff, and I'm a senior lecturer in biomechanics. Phil just promoted me to professor. I'm not quite there yet, although I did apply for promotion to do this. And my main research interest, I'm just going to do a general introduction, and then I'm going to hand over to Carl. So my main research interest is really in child development, but not on the applied end, which is what we'll talk about today, but more on the mechanistic end. So if you look at the spectrum of scientific approaches, there is the applied bit, where you do some research and apply it in the real world straight away. And then there is the mechanistic bit, where you do kind of almost research for the sake of it, just trying to understand something that might inform more applied research. I'm really seeing myself sitting on this mechanistic end a little bit. In terms of child development, the things that we've been looking at the development of muscles and bones, really. So one thing that we're doing, we're looking at mechanical structures of muscles and tendon, and we use ultrasound, and we do some fancy measurements to do that, again, just for the sake of understanding what is it in a child that changes, and how does that affect how children move, or how does that explain, potentially, why children move differently than adults. One of the things that we've been looking at is the effect of growth, and this is relevant later in the presentation, so I'm spending a little bit of time on this. If you look at an adult, and if you look at a child, a 1-year-old child here, they're both scaled to 100% of their body size. If you just look at the body proportions, you see for the child, the length of the head takes up 25% of the total body length, whereas for the adult, it's only 10%. So adults have got short heads, and babies got long heads. And if you look at the legs, it's kind of the opposite, where babies got really short legs, about 35% of the total body height, whereas for the adults, it's more than 50. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that different segments don't grow at the same rate. So it's kind of a prime example of children not being miniature adults. And that's kind of the whole notion, or this notion really drives me to do my research. So children are not miniature adults, which is very often assumed, and their implications on human movement. Now, when I did my PhD in Texas years ago, we just happen to use cycling as a window to understand some of these mechanisms underlying developmental changes in children and movement. And so we've got a child here on the bike, and we've got all the kit, we've got these markers so we can measure the motion, joint angles, joint velocities, what have you. We've got force pedals there, so the pedals measure how hard you push on the bike. We've got electromyography to measure the muscle activity. And we used all that stuff just to understand how children's coordination patterns different to those from adults. So this is really my background, where I'm coming from. And then this happened. So the director of Frog Bikes, which is a new children's bike manufacturer, and he's sitting here in the audience, Jerry Lawson, him and I started talking. We are members of the same triathlon club, and I think it was a swimming session where we started talking. He told me about his children's bike business. And I told him about my research in cycling, even though we just, at this point, we only use cycling as a window to understand mechanisms. And Jerry said, well, you should do some research for us. I really want to understand this. I want our bikes to be informed by evidence. And I said, well, I have done cycling research, but probably not the type of research that you have in mind. So we had lots of conversations after that to kind of explore different synergies and kind of potential ways how we could do research to help Frog Bikes. And to make a long story short, we then appointed Carl Granger, who was a master's student at the time. He then moved into the PhD program. He did some very applied research on bicycle fitting in children, and I will hand over to him in a minute. But the one thing that I do want to make very, very clear, so this research is funded and commissioned by Frog Bikes, but I want to point out that we're both independent, Carl and I. We're both independent researchers at Brunel University. We want this data to be available in the public domain, so not only Frog Bikes can use it, but also other bike manufacturers, bike shops, potentially to create bike fitting guides for children, or even parents, to give parents a little bit of help what size bike they need to buy. So the research is completely independent, and it's supposed to be in the public domain, and that's part of the reason why we're here. So on that note, and without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Carl. Yeah.
Thanks. We just need to change these slides over first. All right, get the IT expert in.
No pressure. Something countdown will be playing that before. Countdown music, you know, just look at it a bit. There we go.
Okay, so yeah, thanks Tom for that. So as Tom says, he approached me 3 years, probably 3, maybe more years ago now, to start looking into some of this research into child cycling biomechanics. Ultimately, the question that he sort of posed to me was, how can we improve the geometry of bicycle frames based on science? So I'm trying to figure out how can we get the scientific evidence into bicycle frames to make them better for kids. But in my mind behind it as well was, okay, how can we keep kids on bikes longer? So that's the main thing. If the kids aren't riding bikes, then big kids aren't going to be in here buying bikes. So essentially, we're now supplying all the kids into your shops with your bikes. So simple as that. So the 2 areas of research that we're looking at. So the first one is thinking about the cycling position that kids want to be. So we're trying to think, is there an optimum model, wherever optimum is. So a comfortable position that kids could ride. And also putting together some guidelines. So again, that we can point to bike shops, give to parents, about how to get the kids on the bikes in the right shape. The second part was looking at bottom braking. So essentially, this piece on the bike, seeing is there an optimum size for that as well. So that's a secondary kind of discussion. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on each of the projects, just tell you how we did it and what we found. So we'll start with the Cyclefit. So I guess most of you have seen the bike rig, so it's pretty much the same as the one that's at back route. And this is more or less where we started to think about, okay, we need some equipment to measure these kids. You know, if you're going to put a child on a bike, we need something that's adjustable. So if you think about bicycle fit, taking that as a starting point, Obviously, a 4-year-old isn't going to spend £200 getting their £200 bicycle fitted. So we have a choice on the bicycle fit, two approaches. One is the high-end individual approach, lots of physiological testing, questionnaires, lots of time-consuming, evidence-based, £250, £300, £400 fit. Right to the other end, web page, put your two measurements in and it tells you this is exactly the bike you need. So we're trying to merge these 2 points together. So not too much quantitative, but trying to get some more of the evidence at the top to see, we've got all these bike fitting ideas out there, how can we get those onto kids' bikes? So obviously all the adults are having all the fun, fitting perfect to the bikes, kids are just, well, you take that one. So if you think about the bike fit, and the factors we need to think about. So essentially there's 5 factors if we ignore handlebars and widths of bikes. So seat height is generally the first one. So we came about to thinking what research do we need to do? So there's huge amounts of evidence out there, so we didn't want to just sort of recreate as well. Seat height, there's probably 10 different models, 10 different calculations to work out the seat height, so probably one of that. Seat angle. Again, very well researched. Well, I say research, there's lots of theories out there. Generally sticking with knee over pedal spindle or COPS. It's often talked about, so we left it, but we won't look at that one for now. Although since we started the project, there's more discussion coming out that that's not necessarily the case. Crank length, 20% of inside length. Most people follow that one. Tom's done some research with children, it generally works. The two that aren't really looked at were the anterior-posterior handlebar position, the reach, and the superior-inferior, the drop. Although drop is probably a misnomer for our project, but I'll get back to that later. So they're the 2 areas that we wanted to look at. So we've got to think. So we now looked at what's out there, and we have to think, right, what's missing? Why can't we just take all the theory that's out there and say, okay, we'll take that, apply it to kids, it works. It doesn't quite work. So this handlebar position really hasn't been researched. There's a few ideas of torso lean and possibly where things should be, but it's a bit vague and no real evidence. Drops exactly the same. And pretty much zero fitting evidence for children. I think we found 2 papers. One person tried it against one bike and he stopped because it didn't work again. And the second one was all about safety, so can little Jimmy get his fingers lodged between the crank and the pedal? That was the only research out. So we want to see and think, well, is there anything that will support it? Basically no. If you hunt around the internet, you hunt around any journals of any quality that you can find, it's not a lot. There's lots of experts out there who'll tell you this is exactly how it should be done. With not a great deal of evidence. It's also, well, I tried this on 3,000 people and it works. Okay, can I borrow your data and look at it? Again, we've got several ways to measure this, what people call optimal reach and drop. So there's something out there that we can use. We took that as a starting point. So I say there's very little, if you call scientific evidence out there, anything in journal articles. But we did have some web-based models we started with. So I'm not going to go through them in too much detail, but different versions. So Greg Lamont had his model, which now seems to be picked up, and most people take a version of it. Although even Lamont doesn't seem to have any evidence, it just appears in the book. So I think him and his coach may have researched over several thousand people, but it's what they feel is right. So we've got the models. I did look at them and I thought, right, so what information should be in that model for reach and drop? Just to see if they're thinking the same, we're thinking the same things they are. So if we take an ordinary bike, as you're riding it, you kind of see so for the reach, there's definitely your torso and your arm length. They're definitely going to be in one. Makes sense. And then we thought, okay, well if you're not very flexible, shorter reach, less drop. More flexible, possibly longer reach, positive drop, maybe. So we'll keep flexibility in there and see if that has any impact. So I think if you go for a bike fit, you generally get tested in multiple ways to see your hamstring and lower back flexibility. Okay, let's take that to kids as well. So for 4 models we have, I'll whip through these. So I just found the calculations, and it's probably not that easy to read from that. Yeah? So Breglemond's formula, he basically said take half your torso length, half your arm length, and add 10 centimetres. Which is really, if I had that in a scientific study, I'd be happy because it's so accurate. Often the point to it. Argonaut, it's another website, had the same formula, but he had this +4 rather than +10. I thought perhaps he meant 4 inches, 10 centimetres. So we had an email conversation. Basically came out, he didn't like the Mons formula, it was too stretchy. It just looked too long. So I'll make it a bit shorter. No science behind it, just didn't look right. And we have 2 other models where they also include the rider style or bike type. So depending if you're a more aggressive rider, the assumption is you'll be a little bit further on the bike. If you're more flexible, a little bit further on the bike. If you have an injury risk, we'll put you a little bit more upright. So it's trying to build in a few more parameters. Now for our study, we thought, okay, we'll try and keep it simple. We won't look at rider style because we'll just keep it simple for kids. 1 rider style, generic rider. Bike type, just an ordinary hybrid bike, straight bikes. Injury, we're just going to have kids who don't have injuries. Kids are flexible, they bounce back anyway, they'll be fine. So if we get rid of rider style, rider type, injury, we're left with torso, arm, flexibility. Great, so our ideas initially now match what's out there. And we're trying to think, okay, so we've got 4 different models, should they all give the same answer? And that would be a good start point, so they're all agreed. It doesn't quite work. So what I've done, I've plotted a combination of arm and torso length and the estimated reach. So the thing that I'm trying to get from this one is the spread of models. It's about 10 centimetres difference depending on whose model you get. And 10 centimetres doesn't sound a huge amount, but on a bike, it's big. So you think, okay, well, which one do you pick? Will it work? And we thought, okay, well that's for adults. Arms and torso are much longer. Let's apply that to kids. And there's that. So the problems we have though is that those models have been validated against children. We have no idea. Those models have constants at the end that only apply to adults. So it just doesn't make sense to apply to children. As Tom said, children aren't just miniature adults, they're different segment proportions. I think this sort of leads on from Tom's slide earlier. So younger children have much shorter relative leg lengths against the adults. But we'll try, see what happens. So if we apply them on, we've still got 6 to 8 centimetres difference. So at this point, we now think, okay, those models just really don't apply, we can't use them. So we're going to have to go out to do research to find out what should it be. So this is the start of what we're thinking, okay, so we need to measure children, we need to put children on bikes and fit them. Okay, but we have fitting rigs, and the one in the top corner, older version. And we have the new versions there, which is great if you're about 5 foot and above. If you're a 4-year-old, it doesn't quite work. So we had a few adjustments made, so I think you guys haven't seen this yet. So we moved the chain ring up a little bit higher, and we had some additional bars on the handlebar inside. So it's now a really adjustable rig. So you can go from someone who's 6'1", 6'2", right the way down to someone who's a lot. So we have Tom and Austin. Interestingly, they both ride in with their heads down in the same style. I think there's something needs to be.
That's genetic.
I think Austin's 2.5.
Yeah.
So we could, on average, we could measure anyone of any size. Which is great for our story. So for our study, we went out and we found some children, which found 142, and we measured 138 this week. Years 3 to 11 at school, and I've just taken reception a couple more. Heights all over the place, inseams, different lengths, different weights, mix of genders, so a huge, huge group. That in itself was 18 months of work. Felt like 18 months. So, that's the subject we picked. So the two topics, reach and drop. So reach, we all know, is very individual. And even for our kids, we found extreme ranges of reaches of what children thought were comfortable. So the idea was, we've got two approaches. We might try and say, okay, we want to make children as efficient as we can on bikes, which is, I guess, where most of the adult work goes. To say, you know, well, which angle do you need to be able to get the most efficiency out of it, the most power out of it. But for a 5-year-old, I don't think they really care how efficient they are. It just does it feel comfortable. If they're not comfortable, they throw the bike down, they're not going to ride it again. If they're comfortable, they grow up with more bikes, they come here when they're adults and buy more bikes. So comfort is the thing that we need. As Tom said, in the applied world, the mechanistic world, comfort in mechanistic doesn't work. What is comfort? So we kind of left that as a black box, more or less, and just said, it's comfort. It's wherever the child thinks comfort is. So, we've got the child onto the bike, we had a basic setup first, and then tried to find the reach that they were comfortable with. So start with an average, yes, this feels okay, keep stretching them. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, bring it back. And same with the way, so you have a range of reach. So this is important as we go forward. So no specific reach, but a range of reaches for comfort. And the reason for that is thinking, okay, the child's going to grow. So if you give them their perfect one, 3 weeks later it's no longer their perfect one. So if we can give a range they can accommodate, we'll start by stretching them to a long reach, and as they grow, it becomes relatively short, but they're still comfortable. So we can try and maximise the amount of time they're comfortable with the fit that they've had. So from that we have two models. One where we find the maximum reach they're comfortable with, and one with a sort of medium reach. We have a minimum, but that didn't make sense, because if it's their minimum, it's only going to get worse. So we'll start. And this is where we have two models. So we stuck with the arm length, the torso, and flexibility, and put those into a model. And it works out, it's similar to the model, but it is different. So 58% of your arm length, around 30% of torso, plus 10.4 centimetres. It's a lot. We then had a maximum model, slightly different model. So 55% of arm, 50 of torso, plus 24 centimetres. Obviously the maximum has that extra factor at the end. Interestingly, flexibility had no bearing on the model whatsoever for children. So there's more reasons behind that, but it just did not work as far as the model went. And what we found is the model accounts for about 65% of their reach. So it's still something that's slightly different. But by giving a range of reaches for both, hopefully it takes into that, whatever the extra factors are we've got. So okay, so we've got arm torso, it's 65%. Is there any way we can make that a better model? So as well as measuring arm and torso in school, we took 18 different measurements. So inside leg, outside leg, thigh, shank, arm, upper arm, lower arm, torso, shoulder width, and some more. All those. Not one of them increased the power or the strength of the model. So the model is just on arm and torso. So in terms of fitting children to bikes, it should be a fairly simple process. You don't need to spend hours and hours and hours taking different measurements. So we have the model, we thought, well, let's just try it and apply it to all the children we have. And I just matched against the model and their actual reach that they came out with when we're doing the research. And it's pretty close. About 80% of the kids were within 4 centimetres of the model. As the model allows for around 10 centimetres, well, we've seen a bit of that. It's about 10 centimetres of spread. The model works really well for kids. There's enough scope on their variability to fit everyone. That's the midpoint of their reach and the maximum. Pretty similar. So I think there was, so that's the survey, it's basically saying, yes, we are, there were one extra bit I found from that. So, we just said we're looking at this range kids are happy with, it's surprising how variable they are. I think Phil Burt, this one last time, when we were talking about micro-adjusters, macro-absorbers. So even some of the kids, they were happy with only changing from there to there. That was it, 4 centimetres. Any more than that, they didn't like it. One of them, it was 25 centimetres, they could go from there to there. Absolutely no difference in comfort, they were happy. The majority around 8 to 10 centimetres of range. So not too big, but for our model, it's perfect. Works really well. So let's think about range or for reach. Okay, the second factor was drop. So kind of hoping the drops as nicely worked with, and we can easily get to an answer. So again, we had some children who thought that drop meant the handlebars need to be up by their eyes. But bizarrely, not one had an actual drop. So no one had handlebars below the saddle. I think in adult bike fit world, you will start there and work down slightly. But for us, it was all start at 0 and just lift. So again, trying the same approach. I mean, the formula is almost irrelevant. The R squared and the p-value basically says the model, it's not predictable, it does not work. So arm and torso does not predict drop anyway. So similarly, okay, let's try and put as much of the other information. Does that work? Being a black box approach, you throw everything in, you might get some random information out, and we did. Effectively, it's saying the amount of drop at the handlebar is related to your shank length. That's what they are. Or related to your shank length and your shoulder width, which also doesn't really make sense. So the only alternative we can have is to think, okay, let's put the kids into brackets, different height brackets, and see if that works. And this is closer, so we can give ranges. So depending on your INSEE, we can say you'll drop, let's say for the smaller children, between 18 and 26 centimetres. And as the children get effectively taller, the amount of drop decreases. So younger kids like the handlebars high, and as they get taller, they like them fairly low. So almost think by the time they're adults and on road bikes, they're not there for the proper drop. So we just gradually lower them. So a couple of extra slides that kind of give a bit more information on this as well. So we said the range that children were happy with. So most of our children were happy with 8 to 10 centimetres. But again, for the drop, it's just much more variable. So there's nothing really to say for children, right, but let's just say roughly it's 10 to 12 centimetres of raise. It's just not, it's too variable. Equally, the amount of drop they have, between 0 centimetres and up to 40 centimetres, as in the handlebars are 40 centimetres higher than the saddle. I have no idea how she thought it was comfortable, or how she intended to ride it, but she was happy with it. Again, coming back to that last point, whether you like your handlebars above or below the saddle. Pretty much all of them are above the saddle. Nobody liked a drop towards above. So thinking when you see bikes in shops and all that, we basically say no child would ever have level handlebar and saddle. So it should always start high. So that was the findings from the first study. So reach, we're fairly happy there is a model you can apply to children. Drop, we have ranges you can apply to certain sizes of children, but unfortunately no predicted model. So coming back to that study objective, how can we improve the geometry of bike frames based on scientific evidence? So this takes us into the second study, in the bottom bracket. So bottom bracket, Q factor, range of different term studies, meaning slightly different things. So again, using our rig, we managed to change it slightly, so changing that bottom bracket width. And starting to sort of ask the question, why is it necessary and why do we think that's a problem? So write it down. So imagine an adult sat on a bike, feet generally roughly below hips, maybe slightly angled out. So there's a slight amount of force going outwards. Imagine a child on a bike with pretty much the same bottom bracket. So effectively you ride, not need. So lots more force pushing out on the pedal, but possibly more impact at the knee. So we're thinking, okay, there may be some risk to the child at the knee. We don't know. So we'll have a look and see what happens if you change the bottom bracket width. Does it cause any difference? Does it show any difference? So on our rig, you see between the chain rings, or between the two pedals, we have some extra spaces. So we start at 80 millimetres, and with the different discs, it goes up to 140. So it's easy to sort of take the pedals off and adjust the bottom bracket, put back on. So we can get children riding different widths. So again, for the method, we took 10 of our sample, we tried to get them fairly similar sizes. And we had two conditions, randomly selected, so narrow and wide, effectively 80 and 140 mm. We tried them in both positions and looked at the forces they produce out on the pedals to see how much they're actually pushing out. Using the same bike rig, so pretty much the same equipment that Tom used in his study. Texas, the same sort of idea. So we have force pedals measuring the forces, we also video the children riding, so we can do some extra analysis with the data we have. So this is what we found. So on a narrow position, the 80 micron, it's about 29 newtons of lateral force. Wider one, 20% more. So a huge variation in the amount of force that's being pushed laterally. And we can't say that that's going to cause injury. That's just one step too far. But if we say we prefer children to ride with as much force going down, so more physiologically just riding the bike rather than pushing pedal sideways, we need to think about a narrow bottom bracket.